Hey guys, I'm just going to do a short video about using JavaScript in CopperCube for beginners in the JavaScript arena. It's not for advanced or probably not medium either. So anyone out there who's just doing no-code games and they're thinking about using JavaScript, I think you'll find this video helpful. Basically, why use JavaScript? Well, because you can do a lot more things. You can do a lot more things with it. There's more codes available in JavaScript to do stuff than there is with the drop-down menus. One of the main reasons. Number two, it's a little bit more flexible, I find. If you've got all your code all in one spot rather than different menus all interlinked, it's easier to edit, cut and paste and place and move around a lot easier. Not that the drop-down menus aren't too bad either, though. They can be reorganized in a certain hierarchy, but only to a certain extent. That's some of the main benefits with programming, I find, is you can quickly edit it, copy and paste, copy, replace, change names very quickly and easily. Of course, there's more problems that go along with it. There's problems with syntax errors, typos, validation, and then logic as well. They're all different. Yeah, so I mean, but a lot of that stuff still goes into making a game, those things I just mentioned, whether using coding or no coding. But mainly with coding, I guess the main issues is typos, syntax problems, and yeah, I would say, and validation as well, a little bit on the code. Now, that's why I like using. I started off with a no coding game, trying to get a game to work. When I realised after a few months that it's very limited in what you can do. I was the one that asked Nico to have a ability to change the hierarchy of different orders of things that are run in the list in the drop down menus. May have been other people as well, but I did ask him that about 2 years ago, and he eventually updated it. But anyway, so you can see here there's quite a lot of stuff here that you can use JavaScript with CopperCube that you just can't do with drop-down menus. The drop-down menus are good and basic, and we'll get a basic game running, that's fine. But if you want more than something basic like that, you'll need to head into even just a little bit of JavaScript, or even go all JavaScript if you want to. My game Saturn 7, that's basically 98 to 99% JavaScript, the whole game, as in the logic, the game logic that runs the game. It's not drop-down menus so much as JavaScript directly. Now, when you're using JavaScript, you mainly be using a lot of these three things more than probably anything else. So you've got get CopperCube variable and setting CopperCube variable. I mean, you'll just have to set it first before you can get it, obviously. If you try and get something that's not set, it'll be undefined. And you get that undefined error a lot if you're looking up a variable and it doesn't exist. Okay, with the drop-down menus in CopperCube, that's all in C++. So you've got to remember that there's the two environments, the C++ environment, and then there's the JavaScript environment. They don't automatically talk to each other. To talk to each other, you need to make use of the set CopperCube variable and get CopperCube variable command that's actually written in JavaScript to transfer variable information between the two. That's how you talk between the two ways. Of course, you can mix it up and mix and match however much you want. I personally just find it easier just to do virtually everything in JavaScript, and using actions and behaviors in JavaScript, and almost nothing in the drop-down menu situations. I mean, I could mix it up as much as I want, but I just find it's a little bit cleaner and easier to deal with when it's all in one section, the code. It might take a fraction longer to do instead of just selecting a few things to hide and unhide something. You just have to type out. You have to get the node, and then you have to tell it to make it invisible or visible. But the better thing with doing that is you can create functions and reusable code so that you can set up that function and then call that function whenever you want. Things like that. There are some benefits in doing it that way. And yeah, so also if you're making a complex game with multiple loading in different sections from different files, it's an absolute nightmare if you're going to be using drop-down menu changes from one file to the next. So you make a change in one, you've got to go and update all the other files. It could be 10, 20, 30 files or more manually, which is just, it's not really a workable situation. That's not a workable situation, I would say. The only way to do it in that case is to use a big behavior and put all your code in there, and then you just refresh that one behavior and it's all updated. So it's definitely, that's the way to do it. That's if you're using multiple files. Yeah, so of course you can mix and match as much as you want. Normally though, with just a single exe file, I'd have a tendency not to use set CopperCube variable and get CopperCube variable. Almost never use it unless it's absolutely necessary. I don't use it at all, and I just stick with global variables in JavaScript. It works quite well, and the code is cleaner. It takes up less room. Doesn't need to be looking stuff up when it doesn't need to do. It's probably more performance as well, I would say. So that's what I do. Yeah. And then set CNode property, use that a ton. That's a really powerful API command in CopperCube. The good thing about CopperCube and how Nico set up his API, it's actually pretty powerful. You can do a lot just with set CNode property. There's a ton of different things you can access, which is good. Instead of having different commands for every single different thing, he's got the one command, and you can just change whole stacks of things like animations, up vectors, field degrees, so the camera's set up, 2D overlays, you know, colors, text size, all that sort of stuff. Light properties, direction, color, real-time shadows, fog color for the root sim node, ambient lighting, background color, all that sort of stuff. And then you've also got post-processing effects as well, can be changed. It's actually very powerful. It's nice how actually Nico set it up. It's quite concise and very efficient. Simply memorize that little bit there. It's very easy. You just reference the scene node, then the property type of all the stuff that's in here that you want to change, and then the values. It's actually, on the whole scheme of things, it's pretty easy to do. I've looked at a lot of other game engines. I wouldn't say all of them, but I did look at quite a few in the first year of using CopperCube to see if there was a better one, an easy one to use. I kept coming back to CopperCube the whole time, each and every time. Admittedly, that was in the days when I was doing no code game. By far, CopperCube is probably one of the easiest game engines you can use. There's a couple out there might be slightly easier to use in certain aspects. I mean, Game Guru and Game Guru Max, they're a little bit more of a level editor in the sense that you can't just make any game you want. You have to only make the game that the game engine allows, which is a first-person shooter in a very specific and very specific type of game. You can't do a whole stack of animation editing. Up until now, you haven't been able to do it. I mean, they're making changes with Max a lot lately, but it'll take them a long time to get even just to the level CopperCube is now. With all with CopperCube, you really can do anything you want in reality. So that's why it's typically been more of a level editor rather than a game engine, Game Guru. I mean, they use Lua. Lua is a little bit easier than JavaScript. Yeah, it's definitely easier. It's more simple, but it's very similar. The same logic and the way you write a lot of stuff is actually very similar, but it's just simplified. What about other game engines? Well, I'm not really here to talk about other game engines directly so much. That apart from the fact that CopperCube, it is an easy game engine to use, and even the JavaScript code, the API codes that it uses are quite simple. Like there's not that many here you see, but like for example, set CNode property, that one there. That can obviously do a lot of different things. So it's quite well done actually, the way Nico's done it all. Yeah, rather than having 50 more commands, one for every different type of thing like lights, colors, text. It's just all under that one set CNode property. So that's actually pretty good. I have to give credit to Nico for that. Now you should also know now with JavaScript, it has its own environment, JavaScript environment within CopperCube. Now the CopperCube game engine itself coded in C++. So when you're using this here, set CopperCube variable, yes, you're setting it in a JavaScript environment, but you're setting it into the CopperCube game engine, which is C++. So you're transferring it to C++, and then when you get it back again, you're extracting it back into the JavaScript environment. I'd recommend you don't use those two commands that much. I really don't. You don't need to use those, hardly at all. You can do the whole thing in JavaScript a lot easier. You can even use global variables. So no matter where you put your JavaScript code, whether you set a new action, a new behavior, or within the game engine itself, under behaviors in every few seconds. So like you got your little execute JavaScript, the little execute JavaScript boxes, you could have bits of JavaScript code in there as well. Wherever you put it, if you have global variables, they can all access that one variable wherever it is, in a behavior, in an action, and in those little box sections there as well. It's actually really good. I fully recommend global variables so long as you're aware of a few rules. Obviously you're not building a website, number one. Number two, you're not part of a programming group of people that potentially could create the same variable name and cause problems. You don't want conflicts like that. A lot of times people don't recommend global variables, but I reckon they're awesome. As long as you're not doing those two things, it's a lot better. And if you're going to be doing that, just make sure you don't use like simple short words like item, node, amount, things like that. Use proper words to describe what it is, to distinguish it from everything else, so that you can't reuse that variable name in other things accidentally and overwrite the variable amount that you didn't want to overwrite. As long as you do that, it's good. It's a good thing, I reckon. So anyway, I'll get back to that in a minute, but just back with the JavaScript side of things. You should note that JavaScript in CopperCube is a little bit of an older one. It's ES5, it's not ES6 or later versions of JavaScript. There's different versions, so it's a little bit older, but it does have the majority of things that you need to do in it. It doesn't have JSON, so you can't do JSON stringify and save. I think that's in ES6, I'm pretty sure. So if you're saving array information or lots of variables, you can put it into array and save that. You won't be able to save it as an object. I mean, someone did do some code to get around that. There was a lot of code to get around that I saw at one point in time, but I end up going with saving just default array information directly myself. But anyway, I'll talk more about that later. But so basically, yeah, with those three commands you can do a lot, and I'll show you a bit more about using global variables in a minute. So the first thing you want to do if you're going to be writing in JavaScript, get yourself a nice program to highlight the syntax. So Notepad++ is a very popular one. You can also use Visual Studio Code. I tend to not use that because it's a bit of a large bloated system. I mean, it might work fine. I gave up after a while because it was just too slow and bloated. And give it a try and see what it's like for you. You never know. It might be good. So I've stuck with Notepad++ as my default code editor, and then on top of that, I've created my own language syntax highlighting as well. CopperCube. The default one is a different color, but I've just dedicated this one so all the CopperCube commands get highlighted in different colors. So it stands out a bit better. So highlight the braces in pink. These brackets, or braces I think they call it, extremely important to get them right in the right position. If you don't, it just won't work right. I mean, as well as the semicolon at the end, it has to be there almost always as well. So there's a lot of little syntax things you have to be over with JavaScript that can catch you up. So anyway, so get your Notepad++, and if you want to try Visual Studio Code, go ahead. This will be a good starting point, and then you may also want to use a system that validates the code a bit more than Notepad. Notepad doesn't really validate anything, as in it doesn't check. You've added or missed for example, if I put an equal sign in there, that's actually invalid. But Notepad++, it won't tell you any problems like that. Why it's a problem? Because in JavaScript it has to be double equals or triple equals. I just stick with double myself. But if you have a single, it won't work. So if that equals that, no, it doesn't work, because it thinks you're trying to set this variable to that variable, even though it's got if in front of it. For some reason, it's not able to detect the difference, and so therefore, yeah, it has to be a double equal as a minimum. Let's just show you. So you can get, so under the forum, you go products, CopperCube, tutorials and docs, JavaScript reference just down here. So that's where you get all the commands. Mesh editing, you wouldn't worry about that until much later on. It's more advanced. These are all your basic ones here, I guess you could say. There's also bits and pieces in here as well that you're going to use. I use pretty much all of them in my game at different points. I think there's not many I haven't used yet. Yeah, there might be a couple in here I haven't used fully. But yeah, almost all of them I've used, so they're pretty good actually. This one here, esprima.org, is actually really good. I like it. It loads fast. This is online validator, checks the syntax validation. So you can see how it also highlights the brackets, the opening and closing brackets really well, which is I really like that, because you get some people who, you know, they like to code like this type thing. I don't like that myself. You know, like, oh, you've got to have in line, straight down, this is the opening and closing. This is, I just think it looks a little bit messy. It's totally unnecessary. If you're using a syntax highlighter like this, you don't need to do that. So it highlights it for you a lot easier. So this one here, it says, yep, that's the beginning, the end, and that's the beginning end of that. So that's that whole section there. That's the whole section there. So definitely use Esprima. Esprima is very nice. There are other ones as well. This one is not the best validator. It does a lot of things, but it doesn't do everything. See, if there's any errors that come up on the right hand side, for example, if I go something like that, put an error in, says unexpected line 9, so it tells you the line, so this says an error. But if I do this equals, it actually thinks it's alright, which is actually false, so it's actually wrong in that regard. A more comprehensive one would be beautifytools.com/JavaScript validator PHP. You put your code in here, and it has all the error messages here on the right hand side. Now, if you're doing like me, you got bits of blocks of JavaScript code all over the place, and you're referencing variables from all over the place as well, which is typically the case. It looks up the variable name, and it wants to see that it's been defined already, but you might have defined it elsewhere, so it's not actually an error. So you can go to options and just click untick unused and undefined. So you might define a variable in your code in here, but use it later on somewhere else, which is still fine. But this here, it's just a more thorough check. So then set that, and now it's only looking for the errors. So line 4 tells you there's a missing semicolon there, which is probably that one. You don't really need that one, but anyway, it's just, you can add it in, it's fine, as well as that one. And line 12, don't have to, but you can. And here's the error, line 9, if time now equals this end time, well, that's error. It won't work, that won't work. So this tells you that there's error, and it is an error. It should be double equals, that's why. And then it says no syntax errors, so yeah. Yeah, in terms of game logic, I don't know if there's hardly any code that can check that. It's something you have to do yourself. If you've got the logic wrong and the game's not running as well as you expect, you have to diagnose that yourself. No code, to my knowledge, is going to work that out. Yeah, so if you don't want to use both, then maybe just stick with Beautified Tools. It's up to you. I personally like this one because it just looks better, and it's just clearer and stands out better, and just runs quicker and faster and better. But just be realised that it certain things it won't pick up. A couple of things it won't pick up at the moment. Okay, so you've got your syntax editor. The good thing about JavaScript, it's got a lot of inbuilt functions. You can use things like arrays, which is basically a big table of data. separated by a comma or other thing to store heaps of different variables in a table form rather than separate variable names for each and every one. Actually, there's an example here of two arrays set up, texture coordinates, that says create a empty array when you've got opening and closing square brackets like that. So when you're coding in JavaScript, debugging is it's a massive issue that will come up. Every programmer has debugging issues. It's not just game logic, but it's syntax errors, typos, that sort of thing will keep coming up. That's why I've used, in some of the time, I've used this Notepad++ with my own syntax highlighting with different colors. So if there's it helps me to see if there's a problem a little bit easier. So if something is not in green and that blue color and that white color, it just stands out separately then, and I can just manually check that and overlook that and see if it looks fine. It does help quite a bit. I'll put this on the download on the video. You can actually download this and upload this formatting to your Notepad++ if you want and use it. It's quite good. It took a while to set up. I wouldn't recommend you try and set it up yourself. It'll take you a lot longer than you think. So with coding in general and also JavaScript, as with any code language, you've got C#, you've got C++ and JavaScript, and you've got all sorts of other languages, Python, and heaps of different ones actually. There tend to be some of the more main ones. But no matter what you do, like I said, if you're going to set up a variable name that's not just local, then keep it as long as possible, like at a minimum 2 words. I tend to have a bad habit of making things shorter than just because it from a previous history of coding a different program that was all manually done. I used to just keep it short to make it quicker and easier. But in reality, the more detail you put into your variable names, the better. It'll easier be for you to read yourself. Even when you come back 6 months later or 12 months later, you'll be able to read it and see what it's been doing very easily, because eventually you will forget what you were trying to achieve in the code. If you code long enough code over enough time, you eventually forget exactly what you were trying to achieve in some cases. That's why you want to set up notes as well. So // and then this is just some notes about the code that I'm putting in. This one here, right on every frame, maximum acceleration. Just I recommend myself, this is how I like to do it, put the code in little sections and separate with a space and put a little note on the top of it mentioning what it's doing. And also if there's one-off weird thing that's going on here, then put some extra information to explain what it is. Otherwise, you don't want to be going over the code again, spending hours trying to work out what you're trying to achieve when you could have just put a couple of notes there and save yourself a ton of time later on. Also with any coding actually, not just JavaScript, make use of functions. They're actually quite good in the sense that if you're reusing a block of code multiple times in different areas in the game or program, whatever you're running, if you just have reference to that one function rather than individual blocks of code duplicated around the place, if you just have it in one section, if you need to change that code, you only need to do it once. And you don't need to go around all over the place looking for where that block of code you have written it in, and then change each thing yourself. So that's a good thing about functions. It's reusable code. That's number one. But even better than that is you only have to update it once, and the whole game or program gets updated in one hit. That's it. So that's even more important in my opinion. Not the fact that you're saving, copying and pasting code multiple times over. That's not really a big deal. But for me anyway, I'm always updating and modifying and improving code. And if it's in a function, all I have to do is go to that function and edit that function code, and then the whole thing's updated. So that's the beauty of it, of using functions. Even if you're only using code more than just twice or something, I would still put it into a function as a general rule, because you might decide to use that more than twice later on, and then you need to change it. And so instead of multiple updates, just put in a function and change it once and it's done. So that's the beauty of a function. Okay, so with functions, they typically something like this, just a name of the function equals function, then the opening and closing braces, the brackets, and then the code in it. So when you're referencing the function, all you have to do is type alien scream and then open and close bracket, a bit like that, open and close bracket and then semicolon at the end, and it will run that function straight away, and then it will return back to where it ended and continue any other code after that. So it doesn't actually just run the function and stop, it'll run it and then continue on, do that, then that, then that, and anything else until the end. That's the good thing about functions. Yeah, so make sure you leave enough comments in your code to explain exactly what is going on. There's all sorts of things in JavaScript you can learn, but most of it is not that hard. Set up a variable in ES5 JavaScript, set up a variable with var for ES5. Once you've set it up, you can reference that variable name wherever you like, as many times as you like. And also another thing, if you're going to use global variables, which meaning it's not just local only, but it can be referenced anywhere in your code, just make sure you're only setting that variable, generally speaking, in one spot. You could read it multiple places all over the place, but in terms of updating it and setting it, generally speaking, try not to set it more than one place in your code, because if there's more than one place, it can conflict with each other and give an unexpected results and all sorts of weird stuff. So that's the problem with global variables. If you're not careful, if you know not to do that, then it's fine actually. This is an example of a global variable. In this case, it's a global array. All arrays in JavaScript are global anyway, to my understanding. So this is set up before. So in the behavior, I'll just explain a little bit about actions and behaviors. Actions in CopperCube, and in most game engines, they follow the same sort of method idea actually, that it's set up in order to run once and then stop, and then you don't need to run it anymore. And as far as I'm aware, it's deleted from memory. So it starts and stops, that's the end of it. It's just a one-off action, whereas behaviors, as a general rule, they run on every frame. Run every frame, so 60 frames a second or whatever you set it up as. As a general rule, they run on every frame. You can change it to reduce the run count to have it a bit slower, so it's not using up so much performance, to like every 200 milliseconds or something like that if you want to. You set up your little delta time or whatever it is. Now with behaviors, they come by default, and you have to be in this format. So you've got the name of the behavior is a function, and then after that the prototype, and then it's on animate as well. All that needs to be in the behavior, the CopperCube behavior that is, as another function to run properly. So these are called arguments. They're inputs to the function. By default, in CopperCube already populates these with the time and the current node that the behavior is attached to. So this time, so you can see I highlight that in Notepad++, and you can see the other highlights. It's highlighting, it shows where it's been highlighted. I mean, green, okay, it could be a bit better color actually, but I could probably change that. But see here, this is by default last time equals time milliseconds. This particular behavior does have a run every millisecond, so you can actually manually change how fast it runs. Generally speaking, most behaviors will just run on every frame, which is about 16 milliseconds, so it runs very often. You can set up a behavior to reduce the amount of performance it takes when it's running if you don't need it to run every frame. This one's by default 200 or whatever it is you want it to do. So what it's saying is this variable delta equals the current time input to this behavior from CopperCube. It's automatic. By the way, that name of time milliseconds, it doesn't have to be in that format. You could call it time or any other name you want. It's not the name that is critical in terms of the input of the data. The input of the data comes into the first index and the second index. So this one is always the node, the second one is always the time. Now that time millisecond, you can change it to whatever you want really, but it's recommended just to keep it by default in most cases. But it is the time, it's always going to be the time. If you change the name, it's still going to be the time. So you may as well have some name variable reference to it. Now with a function, whatever name variable that you put here as the input, well, you'll need to reference the same thing into the code as well, so for it to work. So that's the only thing. So that's the same, and down here, obviously it's the same as well. So it's saying the current time that is input into this behavior by default minus the last time, which starts by default at the current time. So the first time it runs, there's no delta, and as the time gets higher, the change, or delta is like a word meaning change. The change is less than run every millisecond. So it's saying if the amount of the current time minus the starting time when you first ran it, or if it's running ongoing, then the actual last time that this code ran. If the amount of time is less than what you want it to run, which is in 200 milliseconds, so run every this refers to the stuff you've set up into the behavior in the beginning. So then return false. Well, you don't even need return false. You can just have return. You can have return true and you can have return false, but either way it returns anyway. It means it stops running and then waits until the next frame comes around for this code to run again. It'll keep doing that until it finds that, okay, it's past 200 milliseconds, now I'll just keep going with the code. So in other words, it's got its own time limited function inbuilt into it. But most behaviors by default don't have that and will run every frame. So it's up to you how often you want to run a particular thing. You can even have, within the one behavior, you can have multiple sections running at different speeds if you want to. It's fine. It's just a little bit more work. You don't need to do that, but you can. So you can have certain section runs every frame, and then further down it has its own delta check for time. You know, it might be 200 milliseconds, and another spot might be 500 milliseconds, another spot might be 1,000 milliseconds. You can drive whatever different blocks of code you want at whatever speed, which is a good way to do it actually for performance. Don't run anything faster than what it needs to be is a good rule of thumb. If you want to keep performance as good as you can. That's on the CPU. There's a lot of things affect the performance. There's the amount of polygons you're running, the actual number of textures, draw calls on the video card, texture memory on the video card, and then there's the CPU, the amount of code you're running on the CPU, and then the actual amount of RAM on the computer that the CPU can access. All these things affect the speed of your game, and there's a few other things as well, but that's the most things. But anyway, the code running, the speed of the code running is basically the CPU. Unless it's PhysX, then you can set the graphics card to do that if you want to. So in CopperCube and JavaScript, using JavaScript, it's not that hard. Given enough time, you'll be able to work out a lot of things. It might take you a little while in the beginning, maybe 6 months. It might take you to get a reasonable hold of things. You're working at it part time in your spare time. If you're a fast learner and you spend a bit more time, you might get it, in 2 or 3 months, pick it up pretty good. There's not that many codes to access in the CopperCube API, which is this total list of commands. It actually makes it a lot simpler. All you need to do, so set CNode property, select the node, select what you're trying to change, and then select the amount. It's not too bad. You can do a lot of stuff in JavaScript that you could never do with the drop-down menu. Probably at least twice as much, I would think, maybe more. In simple terms, an action, you run it once, it stops, it's finished. That's the best way to keep your performance, is put as many actions as possible in your game. So it runs, and then it stops, and that's it, it's finished. And then have as minimum number of behaviors as possible in your game to keep the performance high as well. I mean, you'd be surprised at how much code and that the modern CPUs can handle. It's not a problem. It's when you're doing heavy graphics and texture adjustment, running on every frame is your biggest drawback, which is still fine. Most game engines run on every frame. It runs just fine. CopperCube is no different. Just don't run things more than you need to. A more efficient way to do things. And also, if you're manually creating a run every few seconds, do something like this. I've seen some people put 1 or 2 or 5 milliseconds. It's not going to run any faster than running on every frame. So 16 milliseconds is 60 frames a second. So there's no point putting like 10 milliseconds in there. To my knowledge, it's not going to make any difference. It may actually even make it worse. If it was to run faster, that means it's updating. So if you're moving something from point A to point B, and you're running it every 5 or 10 milliseconds, it's running faster than it can show it on screen, so you might get some jumps, but I'm not sure if that actually works that way, or it just limits it to always the locked frame rate amount anyway. I'm not sure about that, but you don't need to go more than 16 milliseconds in most respects, unless you want some insane amount of performance, and then you manually override the lock frame rate from 60 frames per second to a high number, then you would never need to do that. If something needs to open, like a door moving or a character moving, something that needs to look super smooth, then run it on every frame. It'll work just fine in an action or a behavior. If you don't need that sort of level of smoothness, and you're running code logic at different speeds to check for different things, typically 50 milliseconds is checking a lot. You know, you're checking at extremely frequency. 100 milliseconds is checking a lot still. That's 10 times a second. That's a lot. So 200 milliseconds, that's checking at 5 times a second. That's still a lot, but it's more manageable. And then you've got 300, you know, 3 times a second, and then say 500 milliseconds. That means you're checking it twice a second. And after that, it's 1,000, every 1,000 milliseconds, so that's once a second. There's some of the ones I use a lot, so I spread out my code into different sections and different speeds according to how fast I need to check for it and update, from anywhere from 50 milliseconds to even 1,000 milliseconds, in some cases even higher than that. So what's some of the benefits in JavaScript? Well, there's a ton of things actually. You can dynamically change a whole stack of things in your game that you could never do in drop-down menus. Drop-down menus, more often than not, they're like a set and forget type of thing. You set it at a certain level and that's it. I mean, there are ways around that. You can, in terms of playing sound, I don't think you can adjust the sound with the drop-down menus. You have to do that in JavaScript with code. Now, if you set using, you want to know what code to use to change, for example, dynamically change the volume of a particular sound, you can do something like that. So there's the set scene node property. This sound node, or this keyword, it's a whole study in itself. It's a weird sort of situation, but basically what it's able to do with this in front of a particular variable name, here's this sound node is set up here. So you can see there's the setup sound node. So you link the sound node in the beginning, and then after that you can refer back to it as this. Basically, how I understand it, using this is a way to reference this current variable name, that this particular behavior or action that you're referring to, whereas if you reuse this same behavior on another player or enemy or something like that, they won't conflict with each other, because this knows that it's talking about this block of code only, not the other block of code. So in other words, it's like reusable variable names without conflict. That's how I would explain it anyway. Yeah, so this is one way you can use code to change the volume. So you reference the location, sound name, a certain variable, file type, if you're picking up different file types. Set the play mode to nothing to start with, because you need to reset the 3D sound node that you'll be using. It can be set to 2D or 3D, up to you. But you set it to nothing to start with, then update the the sound file name, change the volume if you need to, and then just click on play once or looping or whatever it is. And you can actually dynamically change this volume whenever you like during its playing as well. That's just one example of something you can do in JavaScript that you can't do with the drop-down menu. Other things that you can do with JavaScript, you can look for collision points to see if the player's on the ground or is he falling, or all sorts of stuff like that you could, as far as I'm aware, you can't do that with the drop-down menus in CopperCube. So you need to use code for that, something like this. Yeah, so if you wanted to study JavaScript, there's plenty of online tutorials for that, but just be aware most of them are for ES6 and later, so JavaScript, so most of it won't be applicable. So just be really careful that it's ES5, so you'll need to go for older videos, unfortunately, if you're going to study it online, like on YouTube or something. Using JavaScript, you can save variables a lot easier as well, rather than the inbuilt CopperCube method, which is save a single variable one at a time. It's extremely slow and very limited. I use a ton of variables, probably, I don't know, 500 more variables in my main game, and I'll just show you this. I'll just show you that now. Okay, so here's an example here of game defaults that I've got in my game. You know, music, bloom, mouse rotation, smoothing speed, all that sort of stuff. So you can actually do this in CopperCube with ES5. So you've got var and then an array and then equals to another array. In this case it's this array. That's an array in itself with the open and closed brackets. That's empty array, and then it loads the data, checks if it's a number, and if it is a number it multiplies it by 1 to convert it from a text to, or a string that is, to a number, so that it can run in the game properly, because otherwise it breaks your game. If you're relying on a number to be a number, and then it loads it as a text or a string format, it won't work. So it loads, and that's one particular thing where it loads that array, and then it says var all those variables equals that array. So the contents or the values of that array, which then have been loaded into that array, equal this array. So in other words, it's still, because you've got var there, you don't typically have var with open and closed brackets, you just don't do that, but this will work. So it's saying var language equals the first index in the array invgm. As an example, this is a quick overview. Obviously you'll need to go into it a bit more if you're going to be doing stuff like that, but I just wanted to give you a quick overview. Some of the things you can do with JavaScript that you can't do in drop-down menus in CopperCube. With JavaScript you can also edit the input values and what effects. So all the keyboard control inputs, you can have a JavaScript code to listen for that and update your game accordingly to whatever, and you can update in your game and save the changed key codes that you want to change to do what you want in the game accordingly, using JavaScript, and load it back in and it'll be up to date, that sort of thing. You can't ever do that with inbuilt functionality of CopperCube. Even the mouse controls can be changed to whatever you want. Not to mention you can enable and disable post-processing effects with code. You can dynamically change how it runs during the game. Yeah, so basically that was just a very quick overview, obviously, of some of the benefits of using JavaScript. Can't cover everything in one video, there's too much information. But I did cover a couple of things. This is an example here of before first drawing do something. So I've stored a few global variables in here that get updated. So here's, for example, these are global variables because I've set it up not inside of a function. Global variables can be accessed anywhere in the JavaScript code as well as inside of the functions. But if you set up a variable within a function, it's not available outside of the function. So that's the difference. Yeah, so what I like to do is if you're getting something that you're going to reference to a lot, so whatever it is, moving, changing, or updating, if it's going to be referenced a lot in your code, then in your before first draw, I suggest you define all those variables and the nodes. So even the nodes of the items that you want to reference in the code, you don't need to be looking it up again. You look it up once and it stays in memory, and that's it. So there's the player code, the alien, all that sort of stuff. Once it's set up before first draw, it stays there, and that's it. You don't need to keep referencing. It's just not a very performant way to do it. And here's some example from other global variables with initial value of 0. You might want to use a boolean, which is true or false only. That's the only two values that you can have in a boolean variable, like this. Sometimes it's good to have true and false, I find myself, because it makes perfect sense when you're writing the code. You can say if reset is equal to false, then then the bracket do something, blah blah blah. It's a little bit clearer to read. Basically, you don't have to. You can use 0 and 1 if you want, as 0 is false, 1 is true, type thing, if you want to do it that way. This here is an example of a function with a for loop. So I'm updating the CNode material property, which it's got to do with the textures, changing the textures. And this is a very common thing to use a for loop when you're iterating or checking over a number of different scenarios across an item. In this case, it's checking the distance. So it's checking, I've got a whole stack of paths. In this case, it's the alien is moving from a certain path to another path, and in this case, it's checking the distance and finding the closest distance to the alien. That's all it's doing. So it's saying if the length is less than distance to start with is just by default 200, because there's none of them further away from the alien than that. It's always much closer. So I just threw in some default number to start with. And as it runs through it, it just goes over it and over it and over it for each and every path. And if the last one it's checked is less than the last one, the most closest one it's had up until that time, it updates it. Otherwise, it just goes over it and keeps running it, and it keeps running it that way until the end of the day you get the closest one. And what I like to do is have I like global variables myself. So here's an example of time, a global variable. Throughout the whole game, this Aliens Revenge game I made, it's got a number of global variables. Time is one of them, so I just reference time in capitals myself. That's just how I like to do it. You can put however you want the variables and the capitals or not, because it's important in my game. I like to have capitals sometimes, just because it looks good. Yeah, the main benefit with coding is you can cut and replace. You can search for code very easily. Just Control F, find a particular code, go to a particular line number. That's not so much. I wouldn't edit things too much in the JavaScript boxes in CopperCube. I'd copy and paste that into either Notepad or more likely Esprimo. Actually, is my preferred option because it's very clear. All the colours stand out very well, and you can clearly read it. You can click on the brackets. You can see, okay, that one's that one's that, very quickly and easily by just clicking on the brackets. Now, as I mentioned before, some of the more common things you can do, you can use arrays, which is a lot of individual blocks of variables really, into a table data type format. It's like a CSV, if you know what that is. You can use different commands like index of to find the index value of a particular item, the number of it, or the text or string value. You can add things to it with push, splice, and you can convert numbers to strings or the whole data to a string format, and then print it off and read it if you want to. You can use other JavaScript commands like if you're using a decimal like 0.01 or something, you can change the number of decimal points using to fixed, and then bracket, open bracket, close bracket. You can use math floor to reduce a number to the lowest whole number, so 5.6 would be lowered down to 5. Math round you can use as well. That 5.6 would be rounded up to 6. So a lot of different JavaScript commands you can use. This is just generic JavaScript within CopperCube to manipulate the data to how you like. You can do a lot more things with JavaScript, as I said before, like working out the position between objects, change rotation, scale, and position of whatever object, however often that you want to do. If you're running a game, I'd recommend you put like a little debug system in, like this one here. So I've got different things that come up and show me different information about the alien or the player as I'm running the game, so I can see when there's a problem and hopefully see what the problem is. That's the only way I know how to do debugging easier in CopperCube. I mean, other game engines, they seem to make it a lot easier, especially Unity and Unreal and things like that. But CopperCube, you sort of got to debug it all yourself for the most part. CopperCube will give you an error message, but it won't tell you where it is half the time. Or if you're lucky, it'll tell you the line number. But if you have different blocks of code everywhere, it won't tell you which block of code it relates to. So you'll have to go through all of them and find where it is. So it's a little bit more work there. And the last thing I want to say is, if you're going to make a more sophisticated game in CopperCube, I mean, you can. That's what you want to do. You like using CopperCube. You're getting good at JavaScript, and you want to make a more sophisticated game where you load different sections in different files, different CCB files, for the sake of preserving memory. So the whole game is not loaded one hit. You load it in sections. So you unload the current game and then load the next one. And you keep doing that you can load a lot more stuff that way with a limited amount of memory. You can load a lot more stuff. Doing it that way it can be a good way, but if you're going to do that, I would recommend you try and put everything you possibly can into one big behavior. Why? Because when you're updating a bit of code on one level or one file, you might have 10 other files or 20 or 30. All using the same type of format and coding, but you've updated one. Now you've got to open all the other files and manually update all the other ones manually. It's a pain in the butt. So instead, just put all your code, as much as you can anyway, into one big behavior, and then all you have to do for each file is open it and then reload and verify extensions and plugins, and that's it. It's all up to date. It's simple, very simple thing. That doesn't take any time. And yeah, so if you do it that way, then it's very easy to update all your separate little files that you're running the game from, especially if it's the same code across all the board, all the different files, and you're just changing some of the assets and, you know, textures and all that sort of stuff. If you're doing it that way, then yeah, highly recommend you do it that way. Keep it all concise in one big behavior as much as possible from the get-go, and as well as use global variables. Definitely use those. They're very good, and you don't need to be setting CopperCube variable and get CopperCube variable much at all. If you're using global variables, it's just not efficient. Why are you transferring a JavaScript variable into C++ and back again when you can simply just look up the JavaScript variable directly? It's just far more efficient and more performant that way. So yeah, so that's what I would recommend. Use as many actions as possible and as limited number of behaviors as possible. So that would be my recommendation if you're going to do that. Yeah, I've been doing that and it's working pretty well. Pretty happy with it. Debugging, fault finding, yeah, that's always going to take a bit of time. That's why I like to write out my code and then either directly write it in here, Spremo directly, which is probably the best way, because you can it finds most errors straight away. Why you see a big red line highlight, it'll find most of them straight away. A couple it won't find. So once you've used that and something's not right, then I would go and put that into the Beautified Tools one and then run it from there, because it would pick up a few more extra errors that may not have been picked up in the Spremo. Or alternatively, just use Visual Studio Code, and that should do everything you possibly need to do in one hit. So yeah, that's my recommendation. I find JavaScript's not too hard. It's got a few problems with it, of course. Yeah, it's got some problems with it. We're never updated for a long time. It's just the way it is. One is if you don't have the right format code, and when you're adding numbers together, it may not add the numbers together. If one of them's text, it'll join them together, like 5 plus 3. It won't add equals 8. It'll add, put them together, and the output would be 53. Well, it's not really 53. It's 5 and 3 as a text. So that's one problem you need to be aware of. But that shouldn't happen if you're defining all your variables with numbers, a default number to start with, like 0 or whatever it is. Give it a number to start with if it's only a number. Another thing you should be aware of is it doesn't add decimals exactly correctly. It sounds crazy, but it's true. JavaScript, I think it's not only JavaScript, I think other languages do this too. Maybe not all of them, but if you add a certain decimal to another number, in some cases it rounds up the number in a weird way, such that it never gives you the exact correct number. It might be 8 or 9 decimal places or some weird thing correct, but not exactly correct. So that's why sometimes you're going to need to round the number up or down, or there's ways around that. If you've got a question about that, ask me. I'll give you more information about that. I tend to use whole numbers rather than decimals more often than not, and it's just easier because when I save the information, it's not like some massive 10-digit long number. It's just 2 or 3 text values for the number, like 100 or 200 or something like that. And then in my code, if I need to run it on starting up, I'll divide it by 100 or 1,000 to get it to whatever it needs to be in decimal format. So in the game, it'll still run. If you need a tiny small value to do some certain thing, sometimes you need to do that. But when I'm saving it, I have a tendency to keep it a number, like a whole number. And I have a high tendency in my game to have like out of 100, so it'll be a whole number from 0 to 100. But in reality, I'll know it's a percentage out of 100, so I'll just divide it by 100 or multiply it by 0.01 to turn it back into a percent. Yeah, so instead of turn 50 into 0.5, just multiply 50 by 0.01. It's very simple. Yeah, so there's some recommendations, and I hope you enjoy your learning in JavaScript and CopperCube and getting some nice output from it. Let me know how you go. Cheers.